And we'll have the recording available afterwards to everyone. We'll send out a way for everyone to get it afterwards. Other just quick logistics on this. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to use the chat. You can direct questions to Scott, to myself, or put them in the everyone, depending on the nature of the question that you have in the chat feature. That'll probably be the best way to do this. We hope to have time afterwards for generic questions when we, at the very end. Right now, anyone here could unmute themselves. I ask that you stay muted. And at the very end, when we're done, we will unmute everyone. And then we can open the floor for any questions with remaining time. So with that, I'm going to begin. Good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate you all taking time right before. I don't know if anyone eats lunch anymore. So time before what would have been lunch in a normal world. I find that we're all just eating at odd hours and working at odd hours. My name is Russell Greenwald. I'm a vice president here at Insource Services. Insource Services is a finance, HR, and IT consulting and outsourcing firm based in Wellesley, Mass. We service clients in the greater New England area, these days much far beyond with the remote work, in sectors from healthcare to high tech to biotech, small businesses, charter schools, and many others. We provide financial services, HR services, and IT services on varying scales to all of our clients. We've been around 26 years. We're an organization of 74 people. I started the IT practice here almost 18 years ago this July. The IT practice here at Insource is about 34 people, and we provide everything from help desk, IT management, engineering, and super excited to partner with Scott to give this presentation. Hopefully it's very useful information for everyone here, and you can come away a little bit more secure and knowledgeable. So with that, I'll hand it over to Scott to do an introduction of OCD. You're still muted, Scott.
What a great way to start. I'll only do that once. Thanks, Russell. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining. Like Russell said, my name is Scott Goodwin. I manage the information security advisory practice at OCD Tech. OCD Tech is the IT audit and security division of O'Connor and Drew, which is a 70-year-old accounting firm located in Braintree, Mass. So our team helps organizations to identify and secure critical information assets through services including standard IT audit and regulatory compliance reviews against industry standard frameworks like ISO and NIST 800-171, SOC 2 attestations, vulnerability assessments, and penetration testing. And those last two, vulnerability assessment and penetration testing, is really where my team does the majority of our work in that technical space of finding and exploiting vulnerabilities to demonstrate exposure associated with the risks that we're going to talk about today to the organizations that we work with. So we're going to be going through the 5 most common vulnerabilities that we identify on some of our assessments, both technical and non-technical, and Russell's going to walk you through the best ways to remediate those, I think. So Russell, back to you.
So just like as Scott started for the agenda today, Scott will start with kind of what are security vulnerabilities. He'll go over the 5 most common vulnerabilities and exploits that they run across, give you context of how it relates to the chaos that the world is generating and how that's being flaunted. I'll go over remediation strategies, hopefully tell some scary stories that both entertain and fear, and then we'll have some Q&A afterwards. Again, for those that just joined, you're muted. Please stay muted until the end, and if you have any questions, you can use the chat. So I always love to start and use an analogy of as a house, basically as a framework for security. Over 7 years ago, in our house that we used to live in Dedham, we lived in a bungalow, and every day when we'd go to work, we'd lock the front door, jiggle the handle, and walk away. The joke was, though, basically all the windows to the first floor were left open when we left, and there was a big front porch you could step on and just basically open the screen and walk in. So there was a very much a false sense of security, the perception versus the reality. The perception was the house was locked, we locked the door. The reality was it was far from locked. There was no alarm or anything like that. At the time, I guess I didn't really care if anyone broke in. There's nothing to steal. nothing of value, no computers, no paintings, no people to protect. We had our first child, and just innately, not even that consciously, on the first day we had that first child, when we went to work, those windows were locked, the doors were checked, and not soon after we got a big dog. So it really went from when there was nothing to protect, the perception versus reality wasn't as important. And the second we started having things of importance, the reality of the situation was far more important than the perception, obviously. So I like to always think of that analogy as a framework, as a house, as a framework to your security of perception and reality and what's most important to you.
All right, thank you, Russell. That's actually a great introduction for this next slide. So the reason we're all here today, I think, is because all of us have assets that we want to secure. So we're going to fall into that kind of second bucket where now we have a business, and that business has information and other types of assets that are critical to the business processes that we've stood up over the past, several years or however long it might be. So we need to discuss first at the highest level what it means to have a security vulnerability, and what a vulnerability really is. So if we take a step back, we'll kind of talk about a definition first. So a vulnerability is a potential risk at the highest level. It's a risk that could be exploited to gain some access, or to take some data, or to exploit a user. And I think a lot of people on the phone here are going to be most familiar with kind of business risks to the bottom line, risks to the business processes that we've stood up to keep our business operating. But what we need to consider is that the technical risks that maybe we're not all familiar with, those really do represent business risks. We're in a situation where a single vulnerable machine or a single vulnerable user really can have a significant impact on the business. So we need to be not really separating those two types of risks into different buckets, though that's oftentimes what organizations will do. But we do need to understand that a technical risk in a system like a computer, a risk at the network level, a vulnerability at the network level, such as a misconfiguration. An example that we like to talk about of a network level vulnerability would be something that we see all the time on our assessments, which is that the organization has a wireless network and a guest wireless network, and they are absolutely sure that the wireless network for the guest users is segregated from their production network. And in a staggering number of cases, it's simply not. We can, though it appears segregated, then you get a different IP address and all that stuff. We really can use your guest wireless to talk to your production systems, and that's a network level risk. And that brings us to the user level risks, which I imagine most of us are familiar with, but the crux of the problem there would be things like social engineering, where we can trick a user into divulging sensitive information that we can then leverage to exploit additional vulnerabilities in your environment. So what do we do to address those vulnerabilities? Well, most organizations put controls in place to address those vulnerabilities. They could be as simple as a piece of paper, a policy and procedure that will dictate how certain internal processes are going to be executed to ensure that certain types of vulnerabilities, whether they're business level or technical in nature, are going to be executed. But then specifically on the technical side, we should also be thinking about technical controls. So that means implementing secure configurations for our systems and our network, and essentially training our users. We can go to the next slide. So it seems like a battle that we could win, but in reality, vulnerabilities will always exist, no matter how much work we do as IT professionals or business professionals to secure our environment and our users and the business as a whole. Vulnerabilities are always going to exist in your users, in your systems, and within your business. Both penetration testers like myself and hackers on the other side of the table, really, we make a living exploiting existing vulnerabilities, not just existing vulnerabilities though, but also identifying new vulnerabilities. So there's always going to be a new vulnerability. There's always going to be a new technique that we can use to exploit a weakness within your network. And the problem there is, well, penetration testers come at it from one perspective and hackers come at it from another. Hackers are going to do all that work and develop new exploits, identify new vulnerabilities for profit. They're gonna use it to make money. Whereas penetration testers like my team, we do it to kind of inform the security industry as a whole. and help to make the overall, information security industry more secure by developing these exploits, releasing them to the public, and working with vendors to ensure that they're patching those vulnerabilities. So it is absolutely an uphill battle, but all is not lost. I mean, we are going to discuss today effective mitigations and some proactive steps that you guys can take to minimize, but not fully eliminate ever, some of the most common risks that we come across. So yeah, again, I would be remiss if we didn't discuss the context related to COVID, the COVID pandemic. So again, if we kind of go back to our definition, risk is a measure of likelihood and impact. So the likelihood that a risk will be exploited or a risk will actually exist in your environment, and the impact of that risk being exploited. So at the highest level, COVID-19 is increasing both of those aspects, both likelihood and impact. So it's been shown that during the pandemic that specifically social engineering attacks, so things like fake phishing emails and stuff like that, are on the rise, and most people are working remotely. So we have things like the use of personal devices is definitely increasing. Users are using their personal devices to do business, organizational kind of work, including VPNing into their corporate network with private, personally owned devices. A lot of organizations have had to open up their internal network to allow external remote users to get into the network, to access business applications. We've had to face a lot of those applications to the internet. That means that it's much more likely that those applications will be subject to testing for vulnerabilities. And also, we have limited physical access to our systems. No one's on site. We have limited physical access to our users. And then, critically, a lot of organizations are suffering some financial stress during this time, and that is, going to lead to deprioritization of security initiatives. So even as the risk is increasing, because the likelihood and the impact is increasing, a lot of organizations are pushing these initiatives to the back burner. So hopefully today we'll show you some of the kind of the low-hanging fruit, really, that we're going to talk about, ways to really make life much more difficult for a hacker or for a penetration tester like myself. Like I said, what we're here to do is eliminate the low-hanging fruit. Some of the stuff we're going to talk about is somewhat technical in nature. I'm not going to get into the minutiae of how it all works and stuff like that, but if you take away kind of one thing from each slide, it's that what we're talking about is something that's fairly easy to exploit overall, not always, but there are things that if we can kind of shore up these top 5 things that we're going to discuss today, you will make life a lot more difficult for the hacker, and that means that they are much more likely to move on to a more vulnerable target. They don't want to do work, they want to profit, and they will find a vulnerable target, and if you're not them, that's good for you. All right, so we made it through the intros here. What we're going to do now is kind of walk through the top 5 findings, or the top 5 kind of vulnerabilities that we identify on our assessments. Some of these are going to come from like really technical penetration testing type assessments where we're trying actively to hack into an organization, and some of them will come from more, or I should say, less technical types of assessments, like like risk assessments and control assessments, things like that. But so we'll get a combination of both technical and non-technical findings here, and they're going to go in descending order. So vulnerability number 5, that would be a broad category that captures high-profile vulnerabilities. So if you might not be a tech person, and that's fine, but even the non-tech people are oftentimes aware of really high-profile vulnerabilities. And if you're hearing about a vulnerability that has its own name, that's been given this funny name on the news, or if it's on the front page of Reddit every morning when you go onto Reddit, or if it's showing up in your Twitter feed, that vulnerability needs to be a priority for your organization. And I can tell you exactly why. It's because those are the vulnerabilities for which public exploits are available. And what I mean by exploit is a piece of software, a piece of code that can be used to exploit that vulnerability. In general, vulnerabilities are pretty tough to exploit. Not always, but they usually are. In reality, you need special tools to do it. You need an understanding of the system and how that vulnerability works. And you need to be well resourced in a lot of cases. When there's a public exploit available for one of these high-profile vulnerabilities, anybody on the internet can go grab that exploit and run it against your organization. So the likelihood of that being exploited goes right up. And these are, oftentimes they're vulnerabilities that will allow a threat actor to completely take over one of these systems and essentially gain a foothold in your environment. So the number one that I think most people are familiar with, and if you're not, that's fine, but would be WannaCry. A couple of years ago, there was a really high-profile vulnerability in the Microsoft Windows operating system that allowed a specific piece of software to kind of worm its way through vulnerable systems and spread itself automatically, ultimately culminating in essentially a worldwide ransomware attack. And the name WannaCry was all over the social media and the news, and it was everywhere. And even still, organizations failed to patch, and they were caught up in this ransomware attack. So the takeaway from here is what we need, and I'll let Russell speak to real remediation steps, but it's vulnerability management. We need a way to identify vulnerabilities on our internal network and internet-facing services as well, and to identify them so that they can be remediated. That's the takeaway. All right. Number 4 here is sensitive data exposure. This is it can be highly technical, and it can be really, really easy to exploit as well. And we're going to look at this specific vulnerability from 2 different perspectives. From the internet facing or public perspective, as well as kind of the private data on my internal network. And your sensitive data related to your organization may appear in either location. Hopefully it does appear in your internal network, but it should be secured. But we'll talk about that in a moment. Starting with the internet, there are various mechanisms by which business sensitive data for your organization might end up on the internet for public consumption. And the one that we're going to discuss, the one mechanism that's kind of pervasive, is the concept of a third-party breach. So, for example, pretend that I'm Joe Smith and I work at your organization. I'm pretty likely to reuse my corporate email address and password across multiple websites and services out there on the internet. So Joe Smith is going to use his corporate email and the password for his corporate account on things like LinkedIn and Dropbox and Facebook and all those other external services and shopping sites and all that stuff on the internet, because it's easier for him to manage one inbox and one password than it is for him to leverage multiple passwords across those sites. But in reality, what you're doing there is giving your corporate credentials to a number of third parties out there on the internet. And if one of those third parties is subject to a breach, for example, LinkedIn, this happened to LinkedIn and affected a number of organizations, that puts your organization's credentials out there on the dark web for sale, or they put it up on Pastebin for download and make it public. But at the end of the day, what we're seeing is a breach at a third-party organization that has nothing to do with your organization at all, no access, like there's no crossover there. But the breach associated with that third party contains your organization's credentials. So the real, quick and dirty solution here would be a policy that says, we shouldn't be using our corporate information across non-business related websites. But then also from a technical perspective, we can implement compromised credential monitoring. That's a service where you could identify when those credentials are made public, and then you could find that user and change their password. So if we switch gears now and start considering our internal network, can you go back just one? I'm not quite done there. Sorry. Data on the internal network. We should never assume that our internal network is secure. We should assume that a pen tester or a hacker can gain access to our internal network. So data on the internal network needs to be secured as well. So one of the first things that we do when we walk into an environment for an assessment is we're going to scan the network for open or poorly controlled network shares, which is like a folder that's available on the network that contains data. And without even stealing credentials or exploiting anything or breaking any systems, we have found social security numbers, passwords, financial data, HR data, all sorts of stuff just out there with doesn't require any authentication. So we have a finding right off the bat without even having to conduct any penetration testing. So the real solution there, we need to have access controls, role-based access controls on our internal network for any network available resource. Nothing should be open to everyone, which is actually the name of the permission that is assigned to everyone in Windows.
And in the cloud world of things, so if you're an organization using OneDrive or Dropbox or Box or Google, this could be even worse because those tools typically allow your staff to control access to files and folders themselves. Centralized IT doesn't necessarily have their hands in those things. And your staff could be accidentally or purposefully, just not maliciously, opening up access to data to the whole world without even knowing it, and accidentally sending links. There was an example where an organization I knew shared a link to student data to the wrong education system. So they basically leaked student data by accident, and the way their links were set up, they were shared to anyone who had the link. So that means anyone who could get to that link, accidental forwards, maybe they shared it and their email got hacked, all that data is exposed as a result. So it's, with the cloud, it gets even more necessary to control that stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. We should all stop using anonymous sharing links. That's a good takeaway. All right, vulnerability number 3 here. This is the really technical one. So it's going to be technical no matter what. So I'm going to do my best to explain what these things mean. But the takeaway here is if you kind of remember these 2 items here, and hand it off to your IT provider or your IT team, they should be able to identify whether or not you're affected by these 2 misconfigurations. But so that we're going to talk about 2 internal network misconfigurations that we exploit every single time we have a penetration test. We're not always successful depending on the organization, but we're going to attempt these 2 to exploit these 2 misconfigurations every single time we have a penetration test. And I'll be honest with you, in certain circumstances, these 2 have been in the past the only 2 things that we need to go from no access within your environment at all the way up to administrative access, the highest level of access that we can get. Just these 2 line items. So starting with number 1, there are a number of, or these 2 protocols, link local multicast name resolution and NetBIOS name resolution. You don't have to remember that they're just old legacy protocols that are built into the Windows operating system. They exist specifically to make life easier for the Windows user. So if I need to go find a network share and I type it in wrong, these are the 2 protocols that will ask other systems on the network, hey, I don't know where this network resource is. Can you help me find it? And again, it's pretty technical, but at the end of the day, we can leverage as penetration testers these 2 protocols to get your systems to spit out authentication data. I can use these 2 protocols to make your system give me your password. Now it's a hash password. It is encrypted, but oftentimes all we have to do is crack that password, and then we have internal access. So number 1 right here, 2 legacy protocols that are in general no longer required. They don't actually perform any required functions. They're there for well, legacy purposes really. But that would be our initial foothold. Number 1, line item number 1. That's how we get our initial password when we're on site. Number 2, group policy preference files. If you're in an environment that has Active Directory, which a number of the people on the phone are, even if you don't know it, it's a very, very common kind of network architecture for authentication in a Windows environment. If your organization leverages Windows, if everyone has a Windows workstation and you're a medium-sized to large business, even small businesses, then you are likely using Active Directory. There is a certain file that is hosted on that system, the Active Directory domain controller specifically, that may contain sensitive data. Now, imagine I'm an IT professional and I want to set the local administrator password to be the same across 250 systems. I want to make sure that I can get into every single one of those systems because I'm the IT administrator and I need access to those systems if something goes wrong. Well, there's a lot of ways to set that local administrator password to be the same across every single system. The wrong way to do it is to set it via group policy, which is a mechanism to enforce a configuration across your entire network. So it sounds like the right way to do it, but the problem is if you set a password via GPO or group policy, that password is going to appear in a file, and that file can be read by anybody on the internal network. Well, at least Microsoft did some due diligence. They encrypted that password, so you can't simply read the file and grab the password and use it. But critically, Microsoft has released the encryption key for that encryption, and therefore there are publicly available tools out there that will allow you to pull this file, decrypt the password, and then oftentimes, like I said, people are using that file to set administrative passwords. So now I have gone from line item 1, a standard user account, to line item 2, an administrative user account, and well, pen test is almost over. I have administrative access to your environment now. So takeaways for this would be, we need secure baseline configurations. We need to know how our systems are configured, and they need to be configured according to some standard, a secure baseline standard, and those standards do exist. CIS, Center for Information Security, Center for Internet Security, has a number of benchmarks that you can use to configure your systems, and those will include turning off those protocols and ensuring no passwords are stored in your GPP files. So 2 technical takeaways there. Anybody could go on their own network and then search for these 2 problems. And if you get rid of both of them, you're going to make my life very difficult as a penetration tester. So I would suggest you do so. All right, so here's that was the most technical vulnerability number 3. Here's probably the least technical, but it's also critical. So we can't overlook third-party risk. I mean, what we're talking about right now, up until this point anyways, has been risks to your personal or your business assets, your internal network, your employees, things that actually belong to your organization. But every organization nowadays is outsourcing certain aspects of IT, certain aspects of the business, whether it's a hosted financial system, it's a hosted HR system, any sort of managed service provider that actually maintains access into your environment. Those are third parties who have access to your data, have access to your environment. So we need to really be cognizant of the due diligence that we're executing prior to onboarding those new vendors. So this is not generally a finding that we come up with on a penetration test. It certainly has been, actually, but more often it's something that we would raise during a gap analysis or a risk assessment, where we realize or we identify that your organization does not have a solid vendor risk assessment process in place. And why are we talking about this here, and why is it vulnerability number 2? Well, it's been shown that hackers are increasingly targeting managed service providers. So your managed service provider, like your IT provider, they're targeting the managed service provider because if they can breach that one environment, they can actually gain access in most cases to multiple client environments. So you exploit one environment and you gain access to many. That's a high rate of return. So managed service providers are a target for hackers nowadays.
And that's
so we need
real.
to be sure.
We had a client who they became a client because their managed service provider was hacked on their platform, and those hackers went into all of their clients and ransomwared all their clients, encrypted all their computers, encrypted all their servers, and so our brand new client came to us because their MSP was hacked, and I'm sure this MSP had way many other clients that are hacked. And the place that came to us had healthcare data. The place came to us was shut down for weeks. I mean, so it's like your third-party vendors can have a very big impact on you.
Absolutely. So we need to have a process in place to vet those vendors prior to onboarding, prior to giving them that data, prior to giving them any access to my environment. At the basic level, we need to make sure that their controls around your data are commensurate with your policies and your risk appetite, so that we can do things like we can request a SOC 2, which is a formal document kind of attesting to the security of that environment. We can request your written information security program. In the state of Massachusetts, we're required, if you process or handle any data PII of a Massachusetts resident, you're required to have a written information security plan. So having those basic pieces of documentation and evidence of compliance in place, we can get comfort that that vendor is secure, and the way that they handle my data is also secure. And lastly, definitely, I imagine a number of you probably guessed that this would be the number 1 vulnerability, but social engineering cannot be overlooked, right? This is the number 1 way that penetration testers get access from the external, so from the internet. Say we're not inside your environment already. If we need to be able to gain access to your environment, the number 1 thing that we're going to do is phishing. We're going to social engineer our way into getting a foothold. And it's not just pen testers. Obviously, hackers are doing the exact same thing. And this is how they gain their initial foothold. So let's talk about the process. Again, I'm a penetration tester, so I'm going to tell you how we do it. First, we perform reconnaissance. So I have an organization that I'm going to test. I'm going to figure out what internet-facing services they have. Maybe they have Outlook web access for webmail. Maybe they have Citrix for their remote desktop environment. Maybe they're leveraging cloud services like Box or Dropbox or ShareFile, things like that. And we're going to find all those different authentication points, areas where your passwords might be entered to gain access to your data. And then we're going to clone that login portal. So there's a number of tools out there that will allow you to create an exact copy of the login page that you see when you log into your webmail every morning. Then we're going to stand up that login portal on our own server and send out some emails. And obviously, collection of those email addresses is part of reconnaissance. Part of reconnaissance is actually identifying as many email addresses and user accounts as we can to maximize the impact that our phishing campaign will have. So we're going to send emails to all those people that say something along the lines of, maybe we just upgraded our webmail application. You need to validate that your credentials are still working. Otherwise, you might lose access to webmail by Friday. So we create a sense of urgency. We oftentimes will create our own domain that looks very similar to your domain. So if it's organization.com, maybe we'll buy and register the organization.org website. So you're less likely to notice that email address is coming from an external source. And inside that email, we're going to have a link to make sure that you go to our portal and not your portal. And then when you enter those credentials onto that portal to test your access, all we do is steal them. We just write it to a file, and then we take them and we log into your webmail and start rifling through it. So that's the standard process for us. Usually we're going to steal passwords. We're going to, it's called credential harvesting. But other techniques also exist, and some of them are very valuable. We could do drive-by downloads, where I can make you visit a link that actually downloads a malicious binary to your system and executes it. Or we can do what would call business email compromise, where if we gain access to one user's inbox, we can pretend to be that user and have that user request things like wire transfers and HR data from, it depends on their role within the organization, but we can pretend to be that user. And then phishing, which is essentially the same thing, except doing it over the phone, calling up your users and pretending to be the MSP, pretending to be the IT guy, stuff like that. So what we need to be cognizant of here is awareness and training, without a doubt. That is the only real solution, is training the users to ensure that they can identify a social engineering attack. They can identify a phishing email versus a real email. So those are the top 5 vulnerabilities. We exploit all 5 of them in some cases on our assessments, and oftentimes we don't need to stray from those top 5 in order to go from the internet, from nobody, all the way up to domain administrator in your environment. So with that, I think I'll hand it back to Russell for some remediation.
So a lot of these things are a bit of like, those are stories, but they're not stories for me. And I'm definitely more of the mindset these days. It's not an if, it's a when. This might affect you. And some examples just based on Scott's last story. We had a client who had an employee who was phished for their password. The hacker gained access to their account months ago and just sat and waited and waited and waited. Then the hacker set up a rule in their email saying anything coming from HR, have it skip the inbox so the user doesn't see the email came from HR. Then the hacker waited for the employee to actually go on vacation. And right when the employee went on vacation, the hacker then sent an email to HR basically saying, hey, you know what? I opened a new bank account. Please reroute my payroll. And the HR was a little skeptical and said, well, I need proof that it's you. Please sign a form and send it back. And the hacker had previous emails with signatures in the attachments, and it was able to mirror the employee's signature quite well. That HR said this must be the employee, and payroll was rerouted for a month before it was busted. So that's one case of how phishing was so simple. Third-party vendors, we had a client who had a very, very difficult parting with their full-time IT person. It left on bad terms. We called all the vendors and said, this person's no longer here. Please take them off your list. The vendor said yes. The next day, the entire network went down. And we found out that the former employee called the wireless vendor, said, hey, I can't remember my admin password because we changed it. The wireless vendor, even though we told them not to do this, their protocols weren't so good. They gave the former employee access yet again to the network because their wireless network was cloud-based. That changing a password on the cloud gave that employee access, and he created havoc for a day. So even though we did everything right, we still relied on the vendor who did everything wrong. So just a quick example of this to show how real it is. Scott, just let me know if you can hear this.
So I invited a few of the world's best hackers to try to hack me and show me where my vulnerabilities are. And now I'm going to meet them in Las Vegas for DEF CON, the biggest hacker convention of the year. They're going to hack me using social engineering, which is essentially hacking without any code. They just use a phone and an internet connection.
Do you want to do a sample phishing call?
What's phishing?
Phishing is voice solicitation, and basically what you do is you use the phone to extract information or data points that can be used in a later attack.
Let's do it. Who are you going to call?
Maybe I'll call your cell phone provider and see if I can get them to give me your email address.
I bet they're good. I bet they have my back. But yeah, go for it.
I'm going to spoof from your number, so it's going to look like it's calling from you.
Okay.
Hi, I'm so sorry. Can you hear me okay? My baby, I'm sorry. my husband's like, we're about to apply for a loan and we just had a baby and he's like, get this done by today. So I'm so sorry. I can't call you back. I'm trying to log into our account for uses information and I can't remember what email address we used to log the account. The baby's crying and can you help me? Awesome.
In just 30 seconds,
At gmail.com?
Jessica gets access to my personal email address.
Now, if I needed to add our older daughter on our account so she could call in and make changes, how would I need to go about doing that? You would have to send me a secure PIN through a text message? Yeah, well, the thing is, I don't think I'll be able to receive a text message if I'm on the phone. Shh. Oh, I'm not on there either? So I thought when we got married, he added me to the account.
Jess uses my girlfriend's name and a fake social security number
5127.
to set up her own personal access to my account.
Wait, I'm sorry, so there's no password on my account right now? Can I set that up?
She even gets the support person to change my password.
Thank you so much for your help today.
So she just basically blocked me out of my own account.
So that's, and it really is that easy. I've actually done it multiple times, not to be not to do something malicious. Just my wife needed something of hers personal done, and I was able to convince the person on the phone just to get it done for me. And even bank accounts are this frighteningly simple. So how do we patch these 5 vulnerabilities that we hopefully amply scared you into believing is real? But maybe your house has no data in it that you need to secure, so it's a lot less important. But if your house has a lot of important secure data in it, it's very important. So the vulnerability number 5, we talked about WannaCry and other zero-day attacks. I mean, the way to deal with this is to work with your IT and make sure they have an update plan for your systems. They should have a regular update plan, quote unquote quarterly or whatever, and they should have a zero-day update plan. Windows Server 2016 and above automatically updates itself if you set it right, so it'll take care of it for you. With workstations, everyone here should be off Windows 7. When you're on a Windows 10 world, there's software out there that allows your IT to get a portal or full visibility view into what systems and updates are running. So I would encourage your IT, if they don't have it, to get it, and if they have it, you should be asking them to see it. Trust but verify. Hey IT, how up to date are our systems? Oh, they're very up to date. Great, show me a report. I want to know. And how are you guys managing it? So, and it takes some policing to make sure the important systems, or any system that touches your network, because any system, the lowest common denominator is an entry point into your system. So you want to make sure your quarterly updates or regular updates are happening, and there's a plan for zero-day updates, and that there's a portal to see where all your platforms sit on these things. And it's not just your servers in your network. Your website is very important, because we've had a lot of places where their websites are hacked, and the websites could be used to deliver payloads to other organizations, and then your website gets blacklisted, or someone hacks your website and uses it for credit card theft. So it's not just your servers that we're talking about, it's all your systems, quote unquote, the applications, your hosting providers, how are they managing updates on your behalf? Anything where your data is managed that you consider sensitive, how are they managing updates and zero-day updates? And monitoring of these systems, monitoring the updates, but not just that, monitoring the systems in general, monitoring data usage, monitoring disk space, a way to identify that attack could be happening, could be a spike in data usage, especially during odd hours, nights and weekends, a spike in disk space usage in odd hours. So monitoring of your systems is a mechanism to see if something weird is happening, and weird should always be investigated. And I can never express this enough. Back up everything constantly, verify your backups work, and have retention periods and offline backups. We did have an organization we came across who was ransomware, and the hackers deleted all the backups. They even deleted the offsite backups because you could still get there via technology. So you need to have backups that are basically offline, not just offsite, to prevent bad people from doing bad things, and have a disaster recovery plan that you know works by testing it. And lastly, have an actual incident response plan of things that happen. I think it's important because we had an organization where their IT person actually was the cause of ransomware. They got ransomware on a laptop and they just went home. And I can't explain why. Maybe they just didn't know, but there was also no policy or ramifications for that action, so to speak. So I think having real plans on these things and policies and showing them to staff and showing those ramifications for knowing about bad things and not taking control is important. And also when a bad thing happens, especially during times like this, people don't know how to respond. Having a written plan that you can just follow to get to response makes life a lot easier and hopefully gets you closer to getting the problem solved. Sensitive data exposure, resolution 4 that we talked about. I don't know if anyone here is using two-factor authentication. Two-factor authentication means you type in your password and then an application, maybe on your computer or your phone, pops up with a randomly generated code, or even your phone pops up with something that says approve or deny, and you enter in that code. Now you can get into the system. And that code changes often, or that approve or deny is popped up, so you have to enter it. So if one of your staff are phished, they give away their password, the hackers can't get in because they don't have that second factor authentication. And there's a lot of really, really good technology out there these days that makes it so it's not necessarily as much of a pain for your staff as you think, but still incredibly secure. You can block out other countries. Microsoft even has AI with their Office 365 suite, where it just looks for anomalies in the system and just blocks it based on what it thinks is an anomaly in that. We also highly recommend with like two-factor authentication that your staff, there's many mechanisms to this, but they don't use the same password at a very basic standpoint across all their systems. That the password to work is not the password to anything else. You can dictate that with something maybe I'll get into a little bit later, single sign-on technology, or even password management systems. Have an acceptable usage policy. Like I said before, in your WISP or in other things, your security policy where your staff have been trained, like you don't say read this and sign, you're good. Actually train them in a presentation or through video platforms where you're training them how to use security the right way. And then there are ramifications for improper usage. I think it just makes it a little more real for them. We do monthly training videos here, and we also phish our own staff. And so far, it's been really, really positive. The best thing you can do is phish your own staff as a baseline to start. Run training videos for a period of time, and like with someone like OCD, they can do this for you, where they can help create baselines for you of where you are from a security footprint. You work on it, you train your staff, and then you do a gap analysis. And most of the time, you're in a much better position. Inventory and data disposal is not something a lot of people think about, but it's incredibly important. A long time ago, it was made aware that a lot of copiers and scanners, as you're copying and scanning, that data that you're copying and scanning is saved to the hard drives of those machines. When you get rid of them, you're not thinking about wiping those disks. Those scanners are typically given to other organizations when you're done with them, if you're leasing. So that everything you've been scanning or printing is on a hard drive that's now in other organizations' space. If you use cloud technology, you're allowing your staff to download sensitive data possibly to their computer by the nature of the cloud technology. Is that computer encrypted? If not, if it's stolen, that data is in the wild. When you get rid of that computer, are you destroying the hard drive before it leaves your building or getting a certificate of destruction? There's a lot of ways for data to leak out, and you really do have to pay attention to all the angles. I had a client who was a software development company. Short story, employee's laptop was stolen when they went to the bathroom at a coffee shop. The laptop was not encrypted. It had all the source code to the proprietary product, right? Really bad situation. IP leaked. And if you had contracts with people where you had liability on the line, that's not good for you as an organization. So you do want liability coverage with your organization in terms of cybersecurity coverage and other coverages to make sure if something does bad happen, and you did all the right things you could, but it still happened, that you're not on the hook. A lot of liability coverage will even pay for the ransomware or pay to get your data back if it is ransomware. And I've seen them pay time and time again. I'm told they may not going forward, that insurance is getting more difficult, but right now they do. And then documentation. As you can't do enough of it. Network diagrams, policies and procedures, DR plans. The documentation of things is so important because it'll make you think through what's the right way to do it, and it gives you something to follow when you do it. Speaking of documentation, resolution number 3 to internal network misconfigurations. So when Scott mentioned that one of your IT staff could be putting a password into what's called a group policy and sending it out there, or one of your staff decides, you know what, I really want to work from home remote, and we don't really have the mechanism, so I'm just going to open a hole in our firewall. That should make things easy. I've seen it. Or one of your IT staff says, you know what, I need to set up a new user, and I'm going to be lazy with the password. We've seen passwords on new users get hacked within the hour of the user being set up. I don't even know how, but within the hour. We had a client who set up a new user. The password was capital W, welcome, number 2, exclamation point, and it was hacked within the hour of that new account being set up. So back to two-factor, but also back to what we call change management in IT. And change management means no one in IT should be able to make changes of certain levels of ramifications or impacts without discussion and approval, which means no one in IT can decide they want to open a port on a firewall. No one in IT can decide they want to put a password in a group policy, or many other things that create risk in your organization without it first being discussed and without it being approved by someone else. So it's not Big Brother, it's just proper management of things that have value and relevance. And I find that IT staff are never being malicious. We're just rushing. And change management does slow you down, and it makes you test things and think through things. And change management may not be relevant for all things, like a new workstation, but it's incredibly relevant when it comes to your network and your systems and passwords and your perimeter security. Ideally, with change management, you have the review and approval process in place. You can even have an emergency review and approval process in case something needs to be changed quickly, but it still deals with important systems like your firewall. IT should have checklists for their work. We can't think of everything all the time, and especially when we're rushed, especially when we're home and our kids are screaming in our ears and we're doing important work, we're gonna make a mistake. The Checklist Manifesto is a favorite light read of mine. Having good checklists, they don't always have to be crazy detailed. Some do, a flight manual. Some need to be a medical checklist, just going through the basics before you begin. You can't have a checklist for doing heart surgery. If you don't know how to do it, you shouldn't be doing it. But you do need a checklist when doing heart surgery that says, did you wash your hands? But when flying a plane, you do need a checklist that says, move the lever here, press this button, do that in this situation, because it's too complicated to remember. IT needs very similar checklists when setting up servers, when doing group policies, when setting up firewalls. There are so many things we've seen in IT that when setting up your new firewall, if you don't do this, then that happens. So you're like, oh, I got to add that to the checklist because I'm not going to remember these little details. And the details are very important. And have system monitoring in place, like I said before. Having monitoring in place gives you a view of everything, makes you aware of anomalies or changes in your systems, and allows you to get ahead of problems before they happen. And there's new tools out there, I'll say specifically in Microsoft's Azure world and other worlds, called privilege identity management. One of the big features of that tool is basically it's admin rights on demand, which means me as an IT admin, I don't have admin rights all the time. I have them when I need them, and I just hit request. Maybe I can approve my own admin rights, maybe someone else has to, but that request will have a timeout period, which means if I was hacked, if something bad happened, my account doesn't by nature have global admin rights. I have to request it. And ideally, you don't want your IT admins or anyone logging in as admin because with the user admin, because you don't know who did what. You can't track that in logs. You want to be able to have named accounts to be able to track those things. Resolution number 2 to third-party vendor risk. We've told enough scary stories about it. You want to make sure your vendors have done their due diligence, and you need to do your due diligence on them. Unfortunately, you can't trust but verify. Do they have a SOC 2? Do they have, what frameworks, if they don't have a SOC 2, have they been following? Can they show they've been following? Do they have a WISP? Will they sign a BAA? Will they put liability on the line? If you sign up with a vendor and their limitation of liability is like 3 months of payments, there's not enough skin in the game to show that they're really doing a good job. We just went through a SOC 2 compliance. It's not a light amount of work. It's not something that necessarily I wanted to do for a long time because it really had to come to a place in our company to be able to do that. So I don't want to say all vendors have to have a SOC 2 because I want to be nice. But if they don't, then you need to provide them with a form they should fill out showing that they've done all the right things as a company to protect your data or protect access to your data of those things. And I think like OCD can provide those types of forms if you want to do third-party vendor vetting of your systems. And you got to think about who's the vendor and what impact they have to my business. TJX was hacked because their HVAC vendor was hacked. No one would have thought of the HVAC vendor, but their HVAC vendor was hacked. TJX got hacked, credit cards were leaked. So the levels go really deep when you have to think about third-party vendors and who has access to your system. And when you vet your vendors, what's their support like? A long time ago, we had premise-based hardware here, and it died on a Friday night. I could not, for the life of me, find anyone to help me over the weekend. They were open Monday at 9 a.m. So I had to do a full DR failover for a part I couldn't receive until Tuesday because I didn't want my company to be down on Monday. So we spent all weekend working so we could be up and running Monday, though for just a simple part. But the vendor we chose for our server wasn't open on the weekends. I mean, no one. So when you think about the vendors you're choosing and what they perform to you, you do have to think about not just what controls they have in place, what security, but really what's the operational workflow when you need them to provide support to you when you need it, and how would you get a hold of them. So it is a lot of work to vet your vendors, but when they're vendors that provide importance to you, it's worth it. We had a client whose they had a vendor who was hosting their general ledger. They were ransomware. The host, the client could not run payroll or do anything in their finances for 3 weeks. And there was even a question if they would ever get their data back. Frightening. And the vendor was not communicative. They were not helpful. They were overwhelmed and they couldn't handle it. And what I can only suggest this day and age, especially with COVID, reach out to your vendors and ask them, what are they doing right now in this pandemic to make sure they're sustainable, they're ample staff, they're providing security, and they're making sure you're going to be up and running during this. I'm finding this is the biggest risk right now. And last but not least, just with your staff, train your staff as much as humanly possible. Run presentations like this for them. Give them this recording. There's software out there from Atata from Mimecast and KnowBe4 have training software that teach your staff good behavior. Fish your staff often to see if they fall for it. Use tools like two-factor and what's called multi-factor association to make it so your staff, even if they're not trained, you're preventing their ability to do bad things because the technology in place is limiting the amount of risk, though you can't limit it all without training, possible for your staff to create bad things. And just, I mean, keep looking at technology to reduce human, but you still have to train your staff in that. So I'm looking at time. This was a lot of information for everyone. So in summary, you can't secure your data if you don't know where it is. So you have to pay attention and work with your staff. It never ceases to amaze me when we start with assessments with clients. We sit down with all the key stakeholders and we say, do you have sensitive data? And you go, no, we don't have any. And as you go around the room, someone's like kind of raising their hand and they're saying, well, we might keep social security numbers. And someone else will say, what do you mean? And suddenly they have a lot of sensitive data. So you got to keep digging and asking yourself, do we have sensitive data? And you can't secure it if you don't have access to it. So as you're digging to find out where it is, dig to find out who uses it and why, where. Work with your IT to make sure you're patching your systems. Scan for the vulnerabilities in your system. Use tools like Qualys or use companies like OCD who can really do a due diligence on your security and your perimeter and your employees. And then train. You can't do enough of it. And that will yield your biggest success in preventing attacks. So that was a lot of data in a short period of time. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to unmute everyone. So if anyone has any questions in the little time we have left, please feel free to ask, put in the chat if you're shy. And we'll also be sending this out to everyone after and you can reach out to us individually.